Hello, good morning to all of you. Take a seat, please. May I ask the first presentation slide, please? So good morning to all of you. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you here. This is a special week for me, for my colleague, Roberto Vettor and Angelo Paolo Dei Tossa, and we are starting this conference, which is Artificial Intelligence in Medicine. Today we have a big attendance. There is a lot of people here, many students, many colleagues, many companies which are strongly interested in this artificial intelligence in medicine. We have a lot of participants and we are looking for 2 very interesting days, and this will be a great pleasure for all of us. So let's say this is the small program for my short introduction. Let's say that I want first of all to introduce this conference, and which is the aim, why we started this conference. And the idea is really to study the role of the artificial intelligence in medicine. In healthcare. You know, there is a lot of discussion in the population nowadays about this artificial intelligence. Someone is speaking too much in favor of that. Many others are speaking against. So considering artificial intelligence as a real evil. What we will see is that we want really to show that there are very positive aspects that we can take from the artificial intelligence. Means management of data, analysis of medical images, early prediction, prevention, identification of personalized medicine, omic data, clinical information, ethical regulation, and so on. This last aspect is very important, and we will discuss and we'll discover all this aspect today. The idea is to see how we can use artificial intelligence in the best way. So some numbers. We have today's conference, 3 keynote presentations, 20 invited presentations, 6 sessions, 1 roundtable, and 40 posters. And we have a large number of participants, and you can see here professors, but many students, either in the master level or in the post-laureate and so on. And we have a large number of companies as well as citizens of the Padua city. And what we will clearly show in this conference today is just to show which are the powerfulness of the artificial intelligence applied to the healthcare. We will show you with the very relevant speaker which are the recent results in artificial intelligence. And here there are the different sessions, pointed out also to the risks and the opportunities that artificial intelligence in medicine is giving. I want just to underline this document which has been, let's say, delivered 2 years ago from the European Parliament, in which clearly it is shown that there is a lot of opportunity. We need to see how artificial intelligence can benefit and can give benefit to the healthcare, in particular for many aspects. And of course, there are a lot of criticalities, and here we have really to underline where are the problems. And we need also to study and to see which are the measures and the policies that we have to take to avoid the risks of problems. And just a couple of days ago, there was this AI Act, promoted by the European Commission, and this again is a starting point of regulation that need to be taken into account for having the maximum from the artificial intelligence. So let's say today and tomorrow we want to address all these aspects, and these are very important. But then before starting to the real aspect of the conference, I would like first of all to thank all the speaker and the poster presenter. And here you see, I want really to thank the speaker which really accept our invitation, which are here today, and to give their knowledge. And here we are really collecting what is the best among the best in the world about these topics. Then I want also to give a kudos to the Scientific Technical Committee. When we started kind of 1 year ago, even less, we decided to make this conference, and then the idea was to gather up a very powerful group of scientists. We took scientists from Italy because we wanted to have a rapid discussion, but then with their knowledge we were able to collect and to contact all these powerful speakers. But then we are here, and without the help of the local arrangement, it would have been impossible to have all you here with the management of all this registration and so on. So Cristina, Mattia, Marco, Simone, Giulia, and Marisa, thanks a lot for all your hard work. And here I would like also to thank all the students you have seen at the registration area. Then, this conference came without a registration fee, means we have a large support from our institution. So here let me to thank Fondazione Cassa di Risparmio di Padova e Vigo, Camera di Commercio, Veneto Region, the Mayor of Padova, and the University of Padova. These are the reason why we are here, and we can provide this excellent service at, let's say, at a free registration. But not only. University of Padova is composed by 32 departments, and many of these, and you can see the list here, are these departments which really help us to supporting this conference. So again, thanks also for the university and all the department and the director of this department, which really helped us. Some logistic information, so all the session will be here. We have no parallel session, so here is the place where we'll stay for a couple of days. Coffee breaks will be given around the day, middle of the morning and the afternoon. We have also the lunches, which will be given outside, ground floor or first floor, whatever. Poster session will be displayed during the lunches. So during the lunch, when you take your sandwich or your food, then you can walk around the poster and you can have your interesting discussion with the poster session. Okay, this for the moment is all from my side. I wanted to give the podium to Roberto Vettor, which will tell you something about the artificial intelligence in medicine.
Dear Professor Menegheso, thank you for introducing my, very, very short presentation. But please let me say that I'm a really bit moved, but also a little bit proud. And looking at this hall, so full of young people, probably I think that if these young people strongly believe in this new technology, in this new weapon that we have in our hands in order to project the future, I think that the aim of this meeting will reach the real target. And thank you for Gaudenzio for your introduction. I have just a few words to add. And we are here in front of a new revolution, as, for example, was exactly the same at the beginning in the 40s, in the last century, when William Beveridge presented the new deal about the welfare state. And please note that sentence that he wrote. So the human mind likes a strange idea as little as the body likes a strange protein and resists it with a similar energy, a sort of the antibody reaction against the news. So I think that also considering artificial intelligence, we are in the same position. There are some doubt about the efficacy, some doubts about the ethical consequences of its application and so on. But I think that we have this opportunity, this new technology in our hand, and we have to use it in a correct manner, and looking at the future of adding this opportunity to our strategic plan when we think about our patients and our institution, our healthcare system, and so on. We know that the contemporary medicine experiencing a tremendous paradigm shift not in a sense of Kuhn revolution, of course, but because if you think of the revolution in medicine, philosophies, the thing is very different from what we are speaking today. But is for sure something new, and which is the new framework for healthcare, which is a predictive, preventative, and personalized and participatory. And I would like to stress this participatory, because when we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about the availability of data. And the availability of data means that everybody may be has to contribute to this, to enforce this weapon, this new technology, and to have the availability of data is mandatory. So the technological and scientific advancement, increasing information, knowledge, and the unmet expectation in the quality of care are all contributed to this shift. And there is the merging of the two, paradigm shift. So the precision medicine and the artificial intelligence may answer some particular questions in terms of early disease detection, tackling disease progression, clinical decision support, and personalized care. This is probably the real aim, to put together these two new aspects. And we have to use new also, strategies, as for example, the network approach. You know that network biology, network medicine is one strategy that we have to use in order to better define some particular, for example, therapeutic strategies, in order to select the right drug for the right patient in the right moment. And I know that we know that using artificial intelligence, it's possible to put together all the data coming from the so-called omics, and putting also together all the information coming about the economic status, social status of the patient that we are facing. And so putting together all this information, we can select the right treatment or the right therapeutic strategy in general. But we have also to consider that we have some, in the application of artificial intelligence, we have to take into account also some particular aspects which are the ethical aspect. And the problem is, first of all, to be the owner of this technique, not just the users of these techniques. And this is a huge difference, because if you are the owner, you can control the machine and not to be, covered by the machine products. And so you can see here that there are many ethical problems arising from the application of this new technology. And when working on artificial intelligence, there are three issues which are essential to keep in mind. First, adopting an holistic approach. The second for me is the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach, including the patients, the healthcare providers, and the third, striking the right balance between regulation and technological development. This is one of the most important that I would like to say. And I wish you a fantastic meeting. Okay, and I introduce also Professor Paolo De Tos, who is the Dean of our
Hi, good morning, and also I wish to welcome you here in Padua on behalf of Professor Daniela Mappelli, who is the rector of our university, which is kind of an old university, as you know, more than 800 years now, actually 801, which means that we have a very long story. So the first point I would like to take with you is that there is a good reason for having a meeting on AI here in Padua, because from the medicine standpoint, Padua has always been the place of innovation. It is in this place that modern medicine began in the 17th century. in this place where a British college, Harvey, discovered circulation. It is in this place that, in a way, Galileo Galilei found a good place to be free to launch his idea regarding the world and the way we interpret the world. So Padua is a good place. There is good reason to be here. And of course, what we want to do with Gaudenz and Roberto is to make this appointment kind of a regular appointment for the year to come. The second point is that in reality, we all think of AI, and in particular my generation, like a kind of science fiction thing, isn't it? And sometimes we get scared about that because we remember movies, we remember books in which, in a way, the nightmare is seeing technology taking over human power. And we know this is going to happen. We discussed yesterday how AI is an amazing tool, but will never replace the way we think, the way we act. In particular, AI won't be never able to create human interactions, which is the final limit of this technology. But nonetheless, we use every day in our personal devices, we use AI protocols for the good and the bad sometimes. Just think of social networks how, in a way, try often to shape our communities, but mostly for the good. So even in medicine, we know we're already using AI in reality, in diagnostics, in radiological imaging. The latest PET scan we got in our hospital actually imply the use of AI protocols. So AI is here. But my final comments, because these audiences are mostly made of young people, is the future. And in a way, tangentially, we touch base on that. And we all know that, of course, we are lucky. Most of us are lucky because we live in a kind of a rich country. And of course, AI is being developed, actually not only in rich countries, but also in countries in which, anyway, inequalities are still very strong. So whereas we discuss now how to implement AI into medicine and to improve healthcare, we know that 70% of the planet actually can barely afford a decent healthcare. So my recommendation to you, because your other generation will be facing the true implementation of AI into medicine, into our societies, please try to consider that AI should not further extend the gap between rich countries and poor countries. So hopefully AI will actually help to restrict that gap, because this is, I think, the major ethical commitment that we have. Having said that, I really wish you a fabulous conference, and of course, thank you to my two colleagues for putting this together. Welcome in Padua.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo. And now we have Michele Tessarin, which is the director of, or speaking on behalf of Giuseppe Dalben, which is the general director of the Padua Hospital, and will give us some words on behalf of the medical group in Padua. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning. Good morning, all of you, all authorities, speakers, and all participants to the meeting. It's my honor and my privilege to address on behalf of myself and on behalf of my General Director, Dr. Giuseppe Dalben, who regrets very much not have been here today. From the point of view of manager, that's my point of view, there are different fields in which biomedical AI could give the most significant contribution in the healthcare system. That's our clinical practice, biomedical research, public health, health administration. There are some risks. Despite that risk, there are principal AI errors, like noise, data shift variation, misuse of AI tools, that's very frequent in our experience, or risks of bias in medical AI, inequity, recently cited due to sex, race, gender, economic status, different context, or lack of transparencies, or more gaps in accountability. That means, in other terms, who is in charge for errors or failures due to AI systems. Despite of these risks, The potential of AI to respond to field healthcare may seem boundless, but it needs a specific set of regulatory framework. The main healthcare challenges and unmet needs in public health that could benefit may seem boundless, but the deployment of AI are in the field of aging population, chronic diseases, shortage of health personnel, that's more important in our condition now in the EU, in total EU, inefficiency that is widespread in all countries in the EU, sustainability, healthcare inequity due to a lot of different, like inadequate public resources invested or gaps in the range of benefit coverage, charging user, especially for drugs, or lack of protection for vulnerable people or vulnerable part of the people. So all these areas of interest for the implementation of AI experiences is very important for us, for a manager. Beyond the epidemiological application of AI in terms of public health and the opportunity that AI ensured in research, we can consider the application of AI tools in two practices that's very important for us, that are in terms of health administration and clinical practice. According to a study conducted in 2015 by Klein Stern, over 50% of practice time is spent in bureaucracy, entering data, reclaiming financial reimbursement, processing information across different services, or helping patients navigate in a fragmented health system. That's a daily problem for us. The majority of this garbage time was potentially avoidable. AI can reduce errors, support the organization in the field of patient flow, and the activity to be implemented to save time and improve efficiency are about coding. That means for us extract information from clinical records, or scheduling with algorithms, or more, detection of fraudulent activity, which is a very current topic in our organization, as you know, or patient flow management. That means, for example, in the emergency department, if you can prevent or know in advance the patient high volume in advance, enable the smooth operational planning, reducing the probability of an overcrowding. That is so important and so crucial sometimes in our emergency department. AI also in clinical practice is very powerful. The potential for AI, for application of AI in clinical practice is enormous, and ranges from automation of diagnostic processes to therapeutic decision making. The number of hours that could be freed up by automation in 2030 in the EU varies from 7% for surgeons to 12% for general practitioners. This is in the middle point scenario. There are different scenarios that show different numbers, larger numbers. Consider all type of occupation, the percentage grows up to 35% of time spent that potentially is automatable, according to research conducted by McKinsey in 2020. The American Hospital Association assumed that 40% of tasks performed by support staff and 33% of the tasks performed by healthcare professionals and technical occupation can be automated. I mean, 35% is really a lot. Still following the data from this report, there are many possibilities for changing the nature of work inside the health system, including improved productivity. Same workers will be able to do more in less time. Improve efficiency. The same workers will be able to do what they do better with fewer resources. Expand job responsibilities. That means the same workers will be able to take on new expanded duties. Practice at the top of a license. The same workers, particularly clinicians, will spend less time on administrative tasks or improve performance. Same workers will achieve better outcomes as AI helps them or eliminate human errors. Or upskill staff, same workers will learn new valuable digital skills as they work in tandem with AI technologies. And finally, retrain staff. 45% of healthcare executives say more than 30% of the new hires over the next years will be in position requiring engagement with or implementation of AI. Consequently, it's critical for us, for hospitals and health systems, to communicate, to involve personnel about some messages. AI is about tasks, not about jobs. AI is about helping employees and clinicians to do their jobs, not replacing their jobs. AI is about eliminating burdensome tasks and producing better outcomes. AI is about a better work life for employees and clinicians. AI is about creating a better experience for patients. But realizing AI's full potential will require work on many fronts. In the future, 5 years from now, probably, patients may not see anything or anyone new when they go into the hospital, but they will benefit from an entirely new experience driven by an AI-enabled workforce. Thanks. Good luck with your work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all our person here which introduced the conference. Now it's time to start. What is clear now is that artificial intelligence will never replace the medical, will never replace what is the human brain in taking decisions and so on. But artificial intelligence will help all the system to make a better sanity or a better medicine. So as I told, I am an engineer, an electronic engineer. I say artificial intelligence for health is in the same connection as computers stay with engineer. So they help us to make a better calculation, to do fast calculus, very precise calculus. But at the end, it is the engineer who take the decision. This will be also for medicine. So let's start, and thank you all of you for being here. And let's start with our first plenary talk. So let me to introduce Professor Michaela van der Schaar, which she is the Joint Humphrey Plummer Professor of Machine Learning, Artificial Intelligence and Medicine at the University of Cambridge. She is also Fellow of the Alan Turing Institution in London and founder of the Director in the Cambridge Center of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine. And she is also leading a very important big group in artificial intelligence. And Michaela asked me to say clearly she is a very good friend of Italy and she loves to be here. And to be honest, I'm very proud to have Michaela here with us to give her speech. Thank you very much, Michaela.
Thanks a lot, Gaudenzio and Francesca, for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be in Italy again. When I was asked to provide a title for this talk was quite some time ago, and at the time I was trying to put a talk together that tells you more about the science of medicine. But today I'm going to end with the science of medicine, and I'm going to start with ChatGPT. So we all know and have played with Gemini, ChatGPT, Mistral, and many others. I'm sure that everyone in the room has played with these tools. So a question appears for medicine, but the truth is that it appears in any profession as well. But since this is an AI in medicine talk, And since my group focuses on AI for medicine, I'm going to focus on clinicians. So what is really the future of AI in medicine? Will it replace clinicians? Well, my dear colleague, Eric Topol, who is a clinician who has written a lot about the role of AI in medicine, and with whom I have written together a report for the UK government in 2018, believes that AI can restore the gift of time, providing to clinicians time to interact more broadly with their patients and exercising empathy. I believe something quite different. What I believe is that medicine is extremely hard, and in order to practice medicine and turn it from what William Osler called more than 100 years ago an art, the art of medicine, to turn it into a science, AI can bring a large number of tools to clinicians to turn the way in which they practice medicine today into a real science. And what I really hope to present to you today is different types of tools that we are building in our lab to empower clinicians to better treat their patients. So empowerment rather than replacement, I echo that. But I want to say that while I would not want to have flown from London to Venice without a pilot that has tools, I would not have liked it to really just fly the plane without the tools. I would not like in the future, whenever I get sick, to have a clinician that's not empowered with state-of-the-art tools that complement rather than replace their way of thinking. So with that in mind, we need to understand what clinicians want, and more than 3.5 years ago, I started a session in the middle of the pandemic that's called Revolutionize Healthcare, where we try to discuss with clinicians from all over the world what tools do they really want, what do they really need. And these sessions are online. If you are a clinician in the room or a medical student in the room, please subscribe to these sessions. They are meant for you, so please come. Our next session is going to be on Monday. And if you are just a machine learner or a member of the public that are interested in these sessions, they are all on our YouTube channel. So what can AI do? AI can do a variety of things, science, but also the plumbing of medicine. So in our lab, we are working on a variety of topics. Here are a few examples, and today you'll hear about a very few of them. But I just want to say we kind of structure our work into patient-oriented versus clinician-oriented, and looking at one patient at a time versus population health. And in all these different categories, in all these different 4 categories, AI can be transformational. And I absolutely love the last talk that was given by Dr. Tessarini, because I think that we often think AI is going to do the highbrow science, but I think even more excitement can happen actually in the plumbing of medicine. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So I don't know how much time I will end up really having, but what I plan to do is to talk about what I call bespoke medicine. I'm going to use this word rather than personalized medicine, because often people think just genomics when they think about personalized medicine, but the reality is that there are a variety of factors that are going beyond just genomics. So this is the reason I talk about bespoke, to go beyond just genomics. And then I hope to talk about how can we treat better patients, how we can do personalized therapeutics, and talk about the science of medicine, how we can empower clinicians with AI assistants, how can we do population risk assessment and better screening, such that we can detect disease early. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about next generation clinical trials, as well as how can we deal with the data, which was also mentioned by Dr. Vettor, and I think it's a very, very important point. I'm going to start though with large language models, because let's face it, this is a tremendous revolution in AI. And generative AI and large language models are here. And one question that I get asked is not, will AI replace clinicians, but will AI replace academics in general in any field of study? And the reality is that I think AI can do a tremendous amount. So what I want to tell you is what I believe that we can do as academics in AI to really empower and work together with AI. And what I'm going to start by showing is how we can blend cutting-edge AI to empower large language models, and conversely, how large language models are empowering AI, all for empowering, in the end, clinicians and patients. It's very wonderful that Dr. Vettor presented this vision of medicine, because I don't need to go about it. Our focus in our lab as machine learners is to build the tools to empower vision like the one that Dr. Vettor highlighted. So really AI that is transcending all the areas of medicine, both patient trajectories, but also the plumbing of medicine. And ideally, we would like to do that with a holistic view, not only in a segmented way, prevention followed by maybe early diagnosis, followed by treatment, followed by maybe end of life, where we have multiple diseases, but rather an entire ecosystem. So AI for integrated care at all levels, AI at different locations for patient empowerment, not only for clinician empowerment, and finally, everyone that's involved in it, whether it's a clinical researcher, a medical researcher, or whether it's a clinician or nurse in front of a patient, or whether it's healthcare planners of healthcare systems, and of course, patients. I'm going to start with the simplest of all, and this is going back 10 years ago. I used to work on AI for other areas, and it's only 10 years ago that I started to work on AI for medicine. And very fast, when I started when I was in the United States, as a professor, and very fast I got many, many clinicians wanting to work on AI. And there were many diseases, there were many variables, there were many needs. People wanted to build a risk scores for a variety of issues in healthcare. Some of them clinical, some of them related to resources. And what I realized very soon is that I cannot keep up, I do not scale. So I wanted to think whether machine learning itself can build the machine learning scheme. In other words, not replace the clinicians, but rather replace myself. So what we really started is embarking in building automated machine learning that is building, so it's machine learning to build machine learning. I'm going to show to you just one of the many examples of such methods that we built, which is called autoprognosis. This work is already quite old. This is with my former student Ahmed Allah, now in Berkeley. And what we have there is we start with clinical data that a clinician can bring to us, or a hospital or a healthcare ecosystem, and build automatically entire pipelines containing missing data imputation, feature extraction, model building, calibration. But we not only do that, we also issue predictions that are trustworthy, so we issue confidence estimates associated with it, as well as interpretations such that clinicians and patients understand what the machine learning model has learned. What you see here on top is something that's called Bayesian optimization. I'm going to go back to this point, and do not be scared if you are not a mathematician about this word. What this particular box does is selects among many, many models. So we, the machine learners, are very innovative, and machine learners and statisticians like to build models. What Bayesian optimization does is able to select the best set of models and associated parameters, thereby replacing a data scientist or machine learner. And it selects it based on prior knowledge. You see this meta-learning on top, and focused on the data set at hand. So it learns from other data sets for the current data set. Since then, we applied it to many, many settings. I don't have space on many clinicians from all over the world allied with us, inclusively at University of Bologna in Italy, and also in Milano with Emanuele D'Angelo Antonio. So we have many, many applications of autoprognosis. I want to tell you just very briefly about two of them to show to you that this is not toy. In the area of breast cancer, which is an area I care a lot about because my mother died young of breast cancer, we were able to show that the current risk factor that is used in clinical practice in the UK, and for that matter in the United States and quite a lot of other countries, maybe even in Italy, is called NHS Predict, and it tells us what type of risk factors the woman have after the diagnosis of breast cancer and what type of interventions should be used. What we were able to show that our framework, just at the push of a button, is able to outperform NHS Predict significantly, and we were able to validate it in more than 1 million patients, both in unseen data in the UK. We train it based on data in the UK. We validated on unseen data, and then we also validated in completely unseen data in the United States, and the performance is significantly better than machine learning models made by biostatisticians and currently used in clinical practice. So that is a useful tool. But maybe what's more exciting even is how can we use AI for the plumbing of medicine, and Dr. Tessarini made a fantastic introduction of that. As a matter of fact, early in the pandemic, we were the first lab in the UK to really join forces with a big organization, NHS, the National Healthcare Systems, to use autoprognosis off the shelf to do something very practical, to predict how many hospital beds are going to be needed in the next days in the different locations in the UK, and how many ventilators. So this automated machine learning framework is very nice because you can predict something highbrow, something scientific, or you can predict utilization of resources. Since then, we improved on this, and together with a clinician, Professor Owen McKinney, we improved this, and now this is a very powerful tool. So if you are somebody in the room that wants to play with machine learning, I would strongly recommend using autoprognosis for whatever you would like to predict, whether it's something in science, something in clinical medicine, or something for just the plumbing of medicine. And we have on our website many, many resources that can go through this. Why do we care so much about automation? Is because it allows us to have an open source platform. It allows us to determine also when do we have nonlinear factors. So not only we are used in biostatistics with linear interactions, what's nice about AI is that it can uncover also nonlinear interactions. But what I find the most interesting is what I'm going to show to you next, which is we often think, oh, machine learning needs to have the more variables, the better. A lot of variables. Let's put everything in it and then things will get better. And I'm actually quite against it. I feel often in medicine we need quite the opposite. We need the minimum number of informations about this particular patient to be able to diagnose them or to forecast what type of medicine we should give to them or screen them. So ideally we like to have the minimum number. So what we would like to do with this tool is also to determine the value of information. What is the minimum information I need for a particular prediction? Another thing that's very important with automated machine learning, and it was discussed, is these shifts and drifts. For instance, in COVID, the disease has changed a lot, and AutoML can self-detect when a new model needs to be retrained and flag that and do that under the guidance of clinical personnel. What's also interesting about AutoML is state-of-the-art ML can easily be incorporated here. I wrote quite a lot about this more recently with a young clinician at University College London, so you can read about that. But what I want to show to you is what I have done together with him for lung cancer. So in the UK, lung cancer survival is very poor and cancer diagnosis is late, and many people die young because of it. So what is the problem? The problem is that the current risk factor that the clinicians, the primary care clinicians, are obliged to use to diagnose patients at risk for lung cancer includes 19 different variables. Clinicians don't have time in the UK, which doesn't have, unfortunately, the resources. It's much more under-resourced than Italy. Doesn't have time to discuss 19 different factors for a patient to decide whether they should be sent for a lung cancer screening. So what did we do? We used autoprognosis and were able to show that with just 3 variables, we were able to achieve the same level of performance as this current risk scores with 19 variables, thereby turning really machine learning into a very actionable tool, which my clinical collaborator, which is a public health clinician, is trying to implement now in the UK to improve lung cancer screening. So what you see here is machine learning doesn't need more variables as opposed to statistics, but rather fewer variables, the minimum number of variables needed to identify risk. And this can be done in an interpretable way. Now, can we do even better? And it is at this point that I'm going to talk about large language models in the first way. How can large language models empower cutting-edge machine learning methods like autoprognosis? In a recent paper that will be presented next month to one of our top, I would say our top machine learning conference, iClear 2024, we showed that that box that I called Bayesian optimization, which selects models, can be tremendously empowered by large language models. Large language models know a lot about machine learners. As a matter of fact, I think the simple AI people will be much faster replaced than anyone else, partially because AI knows a lot about AI and machine learning. So what we do is we use large language models to warm start the models, to select candidates of models and parameters, and then evaluate them very effectively. So large language models is now part of our AutoML pipeline to empower it. So large language models for machine learning empowerment. What about the other way around? Can cutting-edge AI empower large language models, in particular prompting? Can we do that? We all know that we are using large language models as clinicians or as patients, or for that matter as mathematicians, and try to ask questions from these large language models, and they are incredible. Most of the time we do that using what's called chain of thought, so we put different questions, answer, and we continue to prompt them. More recently, people talk a lot about zero-shot prompting, and you see scenarios where we are learning to prompt large language models by saying, you are a clinician. Given the fact that you, the large language model, are a clinician, think in this way and explain your reasoning. Or we can use other magic words, like Google has developed an entire paper, an entire technology where it says, you, large language model, take a deep breath first, and then answer the question. And such magic words seem to help. An important problem with large language models is that they are often hallucinating, and also they are not aware neither of relevant at times clinical information, or for that matter, private patient information, which we don't want to put into OpenAI and become public domain. How to deal with bringing such sources of knowledge, either private or knowledge, to be able to empower large language models. We are working on both these topics, both enabling better prompting through zero-shot learning, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, as well as how we can interact with private data sets like electronic health records, as well as sources of data to reduce hallucinations. I will not talk about the second, but if you are interested, you can look on our website about sources of information, and I can talk to you during the break. I will talk about prompting, because all of us do prompting. So we all know that prompting is powerful, but no prompt is perfect. And we are all getting to become better prompters. So how to effectively optimize the prompting strategy for each query, inclusively medicine? Query-dependent prompting is important, but it is challenging. At the first view, you could think that this is a reinforcement learning problem, which is a very powerful technology, often used, for instance, in AlphaGo and all the other games that DeepMind is playing. Reinforcement learning seems to be the solution here, but it's not going to work, and I would like to explain why. If you consider the large language model being the environment and the prompting strategy as being, prompting being the action, and the prompting strategy being the policy we are applying on the basis of which we get a feedback, you can think about modeling this as a reinforcement learning problem. But that will be a mistake, because it will cost you an arm and a leg. It will be extremely expensive if you are going to interact with the large language models a lot. So trial and error is expensive, exploration is challenging, generalization is hard, and also we do not learn from human knowledge. So what we are proposing in this very recent, again, AI paper, also that's going to appear next month at iClear, we are optimizing query-dependent prompt evaluation using offline inverse reinforcement learning. So let me tell you a little bit what this means. We have queries that are put by, for instance, clinicians or medical students or maybe professionals in a particular healthcare ecosystem. And they are going to prompt these large language models on behalf of getting more knowledge, on behalf of their patients, and so on. This data set can be kept local, and this is what I'm going to call the prompt alignment data set. And this prompt alignment data set can be then used as a very powerful source of knowledge. We are learning from other clinicians, other colleagues, other people. And on the basis of this, we can then use inverse reinforcement learning. Inverse reinforcement learning is the opposite of reinforcement learning. We are not learning a policy, but rather we are learning a reward on the basis of the actions and the policies we see in the data. So we see how other people prompted and when they were satisfied with the answer and when they were not. And we use that to learn what's called in machine learning an embedding between the queries and the prompts to evaluate a reward model that is going to be able to tell us how good the prompting is for a particular source of query, for a particular query. And how will be the best way for what you want to achieve from the large language model to query? So let's assume I want to, for instance, get a certain information about a patient in front of me. What will be the best way to query this large language model to get this answer? The advantage is that if we use this inverse reinforcement learning, we are able to learn the optimal prompt for the desired query without the need to experiment with the large language models. So this will have two advantages. It is low cost, you don't need to pay anything for it, and also you can collaborate together with other colleagues to build this data set on the basis of which one can learn the optimal way to prompt. Let me try to explain this in a different way. We hear a lot about alignment, human-machine alignment. And actually large language models are trained by doing RLHF, which stands for reinforcement learning from human feedback. And what we try to do in RLHF is we try to align the large language models with the preference of human feedback. This is done by all the ChatGPTs, Geminis, and so on. What we are trying to do here is the opposite. In prompt optimization, we align the prompter's prompt to the large language model's capabilities. So we learn through inverse reinforcement learning a process of inverse alignment. We are taking a human and its needs through their queries and inverse align them to the capabilities of the large language models to be able to get the best possible outcome. This is just one of the many examples and a powerful one for medicine. Let me now say something about how can we treat patients. Ideally, we would like to do this in a personalized way, and we would like to identify for a patient, given their diagnosis, how to treat, when to treat, and potentially when to stop treatment or when to change to another treatment. And ideally, we would like to learn that on the basis of observational data, such as electronic health records of that particular patient. How can we do that? By learning from other patients locally or globally. So we have access to electronic health record data, and on the basis of it, we would like to learn this individualized treatment's effect, and we do that through a process of causal effect inference. So this is not a prediction problem, this is a causal effect inference problem, because we are intervening on these patients. So by deciding to treat or not to treat, when to treat, for how long to treat, we turn the problem from a prediction problem, forecasting problem, into an intervention problem. And what we have at our disposal is patient features, how they change over time, static information, such as, for instance, genomic information or other information about the patient, as well as time-dependent treatments. And the treatments are changing depending on the outcomes of the patient so far. So treatments and variables are entangled together, thereby posing this important problem of causal inference. Another challenge is we do not observe counterfactuals. We do not know what would have happened to the patient if we would have treated later or with another treatment. So what is really here at stake is we move beyond association and risk prediction into the era of causality, But a lot of the work in the machine learning world, I'm quite upset with it, focus only on causality statically. But causality statically is not interesting. What's interesting, by nature, by its very nature, causality is a dynamic process, it's a time series process. So we need to think not only that this caused that, but when, and according to what factors. So we need to go way beyond the way of thinking in causality. And an important area is time. Because what we really need to understand is how these different types of patient variables are changing as a result of interventions. And what you see here is a time series causal graph that is evolving. And again, a graph is not enough. Everybody loves graphs, but graphs are just not enough. You need to also understand the parametric and non-parametric relationships between these variables. It is not that smoking one cigarette will cause cancer. How many of them, and how does it interact with other factors? So relationships between these variables matter as well. So how do we deal with this? Early work in this area, seminal work, which I love a lot, by Robbins and Hernan and Brumbach, developed these marginal structural models that take observational data and through inverse probability of treatment weighting try to discover average treatment effects over time. Inspired by this, a few years ago, we changed these linear models into nonlinear models using AI, recurrent neural networks. But what we want to do is not to just do average treatment effects. We want to look at personalization and personalized treatment effects. So for that, what we ended up doing is trying really to use ideas from translation and that are very much empowering right now, also things like ChatGPT. So let's assume I want to translate something from Italian to English or vice versa. Often we use sequence-to-sequence models. So the way in which you can think about them being used here is I use the sequence of patients' covariates before treatment, and I'm translating to another language after treatment. I also want to say that this is not enough. This is much more challenging than a translation because I have interventions, I have actions. And because of that, we need to do something to balance these different representations, to deal with different covariate shifts. And for that, we do domain adversarial training. Moving even further, we started to say, well, this shouldn't be modeled as a discrete process, but rather as a continuous process. Human body is a dynamical system that evolves continuously over time. So this is when we started to bring other more powerful tools in AI, such as neurally controlled differential equations. I'm not going to talk much about that. I'm going to tell you that this sounds good, but has a very important limitation. It predicts extremely well, but we don't understand why. And in medicine, we want clinicians to understand and be in control. So before I'm going to talk about how to turn this into white box model and real science, let me say that another thing that's important is these tools, how do I know that they are really working well? It's quite difficult. One is to verify them by looking at factuals, so to see that indeed patients who are using these drugs at this moment in time indeed behave the way we think. But we do not know counterfactuals, so we are not able to estimate the counterfactuals. But what we can do is, if we see if we can reproduce randomized controlled trials. And again, this is something that we have tried, so what we have built is another AI method together with clinical collaborators where we are using ideas from synthetic control with ideas from AI to reproduce using machine learning randomized controlled trials. And what we in effect do in this synthetic twin, we are building actually a synthetic twin of the patients with treatments and without treatments and try to really estimate outcomes of trials. So in particular, we looked at a heart protection study in the United Kingdom, which tries to estimate the statins LDL lowering effect. And we wanted to see if we could have predicted from observational data the outcome of such a randomized controlled trial. And what we use for that is observational data from electronic health records in the form of a very powerful data set existing in the UK, CPRD, excuse me. And what we show is that indeed synthetic twin is able to uncover this average treatment effect, and even better than the randomized controlled trial, with tighter confidence estimates, which is unsurprising because we have a lot more data. While baselines that are based on other machine learning methods or statistics fail. If you are interested to read more about this, for us has been a 10-year journey. We have both tutorials and papers associated with personalized therapeutics. Take a look. What I'd like to talk to you in the final minutes of this talk is about the science of medicine, because I do not think causality is the end. What is the end is really looking at governing equations of the human body. This is only when we will have the science of medicine and turn really medicine in the clinical world to a real true science. Right now, science in medicine, and for that matter in physics, is done through brilliant minds. In physics, in physiology with Hill, and also in psychology with Kahneman. So it is these very brilliant experts which are teasing these equations of physics, physiology, or psychology. But let's be honest, we don't have a Kahneman, or for that matter a Hill or an Einstein being born every day. That's number one. Number two, many experts are wrong. We know that from physics, where subsequent scientists improve of each other. Galileo Galilei, who is one of my favorites, was just mentioned earlier, and we know that his initial hypotheses were amazing, but they were further refined in several domains. So can we really use machine learning to improve human scientists to build true discoveries? Can we really come up on, because we know also the humans are not able to work with a lot of variables. Often they may be stuck on a particular hypothesis which may be untrue. And machines don't have egos and are able to process more information. So the focus is, can we use machine learning to empower human scientists in medicine, but why not physics and other areas? And for that, what we need to discover is really not only functions, but ideally dynamical systems in the form of ordinal differential equations and partial differential equations. And we are very familiar, unfortunately, with physics and less with equations in medicine. But in physics, we all learn Newton's law and heat equation. And this is useful in any area in medicine, inclusively physiology, pharmacology, and epidemiology. But doing this and learning this from data is very hard. So learning dynamical system on the basis of trajectories of patients and learning not in a black box machine learning way, but rather real equations, the laws of Newton of the human body, or the Schrödinger equations of the complex human body is hard. And since most of you are not machine learning researchers, let me say that this has been tried for a very long time and failed. And partially it failed is because in the data we just we have observations, but we don't see derivatives. I'm going to be very fast. So what we are actually, we were able to do that. We were able to learn on the basis of data such dynamical equations and discover this without looking at derivatives, thereby being able to learn everything from tumor growth to pharmacological models to epidemiological models. We were even able to do that for PDEs, partial differential equations. And this is even trickier. And the reason we care about this is if it is to discover interpretable laws of nature in medicine, in population models, we need such powerful tools. And AI is able increasingly to learn to do discoveries. And what it needs is clinical scientists now eager to capitalize on these tools with brilliance to do the next generation of discovery. So with this in mind, this is my last slide. I believe that it's a very exciting time ahead of us, not only because of large language models, but using the power of new AI, inclusively large language models, we can make new discoveries, empowering clinical scientists and patients alike. And I hope to go at the very end of this talk, but which was supposed to be much longer, but I don't know how to do that. So anyway, I'm just going to leave it here and say that I would like to ask you, if you are interested and you are a clinician, to join us in our Revolutionizing Healthcare sessions. Thank you very much.
you here. Thank you very much, Michaela, for this excellent talk and very inspiring. I hope it has been the same feeling also for all of you. Maybe we have time for one quick question. We are a little bit late, but Michaela will be around here for answer any further question, if any. Okay, so thank you. Let's go forward. Thank you very much, Michaela. So now we move to the second talk of today, which is Yael Ophir. Yael, we move from, let's say, the academic to the real industry application side. So please, Yael, join me here. Yael is an executive director of Health IL, the leading healthcare innovation ecosystem, which actively supporting transformation and innovation in healthcare system globally. So, Yael, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. I usually dislike podiums, so I'll just stand here. I'm very excited to be here. I'm in Italy, in Padova. I think that, Italy has a long tradition of innovation, an innovation culture. And as we also see in Israel, and we are very excited to share the experiences and to collaborate. Now, as I said, my name is Yael. I'm from Health IL. And as you can see, the first slide, and if we talk about culture, doesn't have any generated AI people, but actual people. Because my talk today will be more looking at, the culture, the change management prism involving AI, obviously. Now, what we're going to see today. So the first part is actually to have what we call real-life practice. I have a master in immunobiology, and I decided to leave the academy in order to develop the innovation in healthcare ecosystem and to experience from the other side and kind of getting our hands dirty and see what works. And this is the first part. The second part that I would like to, to have all today is actually to look beyond AI tech, or not just AI tech. And we'll try to deep dive and understand the different components surrounding AI, which leads to better implementation in health systems. And from what we experience, and I'll show a few hands-on examples, various and different sectors of healthcare and how it works in health organizations and hospitals. And how do I know all that? Because Health IL, we are kind of a sensor of the innovation healthcare ecosystem. So just maybe a few words of our journey and how I can just stand and talk about all of that. So we are Health IL. Our mission is to support and empower innovation and transformation in health systems in Israel and worldwide. We are a nonprofit. We are backed by several ministries. And that allows us actually to be kind of a nonprofit working on a government side and trying to work with everyone and to actually endorse and catalyze the entire ecosystem. Now, we started in late 2017, and back then, and I know you probably heard about the startup nation. Israel had lots of startups, so we already had lots of startups, investors, governments, and multinationals taking part of kind of the innovation ecosystem. But we have twice the amount of startups per capita than the US in healthcare alone. But when we try to do something within the health system, we couldn't succeed at all. We failed time after time. And with all the proud of being the most innovative in tech, we couldn't transform our own health system, which is, I guess, like other public systems, it has, long waiting lists, a lot of workforce working for hours and hours, and etc. So you see that there's a large missing component here, which are the health organizations. And I guess that you all know that health organizations exist, hospitals exist, but they didn't have the time or the attention to get out of their everyday work and try to practice innovation. And that's exactly what we did. We built the entire infrastructure for innovation management. Innovation has been back to long centuries ago, but innovation management, the ability as a hospital to manage your innovation and decide what works, what the system could drive, and what are the challenges of the system, that's really what changes from our side. And we saw an immediate increase, and it's also, again, it's important to say it's a work in progress. We can see the needle shifting, but we see tenfold of increase in pilots. We see increased and more personalized, sector-specific, I will say, government funding, and we see a major shift from just experience with innovation to implementation. That's the reason that we can really talk about implementation. So from 6 innovation centers and innovation managers in hospitals back in 2016, we now see almost 130 innovation managers and 65 innovation centers. It's important to say that these are large, small, rural, central country hospitals, really across the board. It's really a complete change nationwide. And you can also see the increase in the amount of startups and amount of collaborations, which really has a kind of an exponential growth with shortening the amount of time of implementing tech from 2 to 3 years to even months. And we'll see some examples around that. I must say that Health.il as a nonprofit nationwide, we are kind of also a censor, and we have a lot of different publications around the collaboration status, the different type of collaborations, the landscape of challenges that the healthcare system experience, and how we can support in solving them. So if I will say what we do today, we work in 4 main pillars. First of all is the layer of innovation management, and this is what was a huge missing link and a huge success of actually having hospitals dealing every day with implementing, obviously, AI, and other tech, and they also work together. The second part is effective collaborations. We don't only look for an interesting tech, but we understand what are the constraints within the hospitals that will allow implementation. And the third part is actually, because we work with the government, we understand we can deliver the bottlenecks of and what the ecosystem is experiencing, but we can also adjust different funding factors for that. And the fourth one isn't, I will say it's rather new. We try not only to be surrounded by our knowledge, but obviously there's a lot of knowledge about implementation today and innovation in AI and collaboration in healthcare. So we really try to bridge between health organizations and ecosystems. Now, before I go and jump into really the AI examples, I wanted to show what was the progress with, looking from a perspective of AI and innovation. Now, if we look at the hospitals, and it's saying innovation management, but it's essentially the hospital way of how they were looking at things in Israel, we can see 2 periods. The first one is like I call it the innovation festival period. That luckily was a bit short and ended by COVID. Before that, everyone really looked at everything that might be relevant in 30 years, but not what will be relevant for the system today. And I think that, COVID was a wake-up call for everyone. And we saw them looking more in deployment forward approach. So they look what is relevant to implement now and in the next few years. And also, we see AI realization. We asked actually in 2020 the different hospitals what they see that they would like to implement. Now it really, they said AI and they delivered it a few years later. So the second period was actually looking on what would be the unique value proposition of a hospital, and we really see the infrastructure and much more implementation. This is only one side of that, but you can see that the government really backed all along the way with different resources to support AI. I think the next session will be the role of AI, of data in AI. This was one of really major thing. We have now over 19 innovation R&D infrastructure in hospitals, and also 4 NLP-oriented ones. Now, what will be the next steps? We hope we get more resources on implementation, which is now the bottleneck, and to have more and more interoperability and multidisciplinary work. And as you can see, we will see in a minute, it's really a work in progress. Just maybe, just to be aware of time. Okay, so if we look at startups, and obviously there is a lot of innovation in the academy, as we will all see in the next 2 days. But in our database, we have almost 1,100 startups in healthcare. And when we looked at, and they tag themselves, and we also tag them on which components comprise of the tech components of their own activity. So you can see this is the percentage of startups out of the entire amount of startups in a specific area that have AI components. Obviously, predictive analytics, imaging was one of the first ones to implement innovation, and data integration, definitely. But I think also very interestingly, you can see that the treatment part is also kind of, you would say it's lacking of AI. But I think the opposite is true. Sometimes when you look at innovation, and we try to separate it, you have some incremental innovation where you can implement not very complicated mechanisms that are also beneficial, and obviously AI on that. So when I started to work on this lecture, I actually, we have a forum of 130 innovation managers, and I started to interview them on what their experience with implementing AI. And not only the tech side, but all the different components that really affect a good I won't say good, but effective implementation of AI tech in hospitals. Now, what we see, we have 3 components. The first one, I call it generally AI tech, but I'm not going to go deeper because the entire 2 days are discussing a different, really, like Michaela was presenting, the most advanced level of AI applications. The second part is integration, which is also highly important, and the workforce side. So if we look, and it's just, a scheme of the different components, and you have much more. So again, on the AI, we are just the sensors and not the experts, but definitely in integration, we are talking about EMR integration, which is super complex, and even in a very well data established country, we are still struggling a lot with that. Data standardization, we'll talk about it soon, but we use ICD-9, which it makes everything highly complex with different models. Also cloud policy, because a lot of innovation, it's cloud-based. That means that could be, if it's not solved in a hospital, it will take more time. And it's, as long as you go further and further, and you try to integrate a lot of different informations and to support the decision of clinicians, it makes more complicated. And obviously the workforce. We see it as I think everyone would testify that this is the main hurdle, not as a hurdle, but it's how we can convince, how we can have and empower physicians and medical staff across the board to do and to take part of that. So if we can put it on a three-dimensional model, we can look as we go further along the axis, it's a complexity. It gets more and more complex. It's not only one variable, but really a comprehensive variables. And when you get closer to 0, obviously it's less complicated. And I'm going to show you a few examples. Each one of these examples, you can get the full information on anyone, and we'll be happy to connect to them. You can see, and I will say that's like, some of these examples are for big and hospitals or HMOs, but some of them are in rural areas of Israel. So again, you can see it's really spread out across the country. Now, we'll see from more real-time intervention, early detection, decision support, NLP, or we call it small language model, and Gen AI, obviously. And when we put it on, the 3D scheme, you can see that there again, you can look at, and we can analyze each one of the use cases and understand what are the different components. As obviously, as it gets more into integration, you can integrate it step by step, and we'll see it in a minute. So the first use case, I think it's kind of a straightforward one. I think that there are more than 30 implementation already recorded in this kind of area. But this is in Galil Medical Center. This is like frontline northern large hospital where actually you can see here an example of an Israeli startup company implemented in the hospital. And what's interesting here is like just one example is that the person came for a non-urgent CT check, brain CT, and just he underwent it and just went away of the hospital. And at the gate of the hospital, someone called him and said, "You should come back because we detected an urgent matter," and they intervened in a few hours and saved his life. If you didn't have this kind of an overlay of application and also an alert system that went directly for the head of the radiology unit, it would have taken 24 hours, could be 3 days until they understood that, and it could be too late for this person. Now, if you look at the 3 dimensions, you can see that the AI part is the layer is great tech, but the integration part wasn't that hard. It's basically a layer of AI on an existing mechanism, on an existing equipment. That means that it's not really needed to be integrated to the system. And also, if you look at the workforce, basically it's just an alert into the mobile of one person at the head of the unit. So again, this is like first steps that we see in rural places as well. The second one, and I think we get a lot of references at the beginning, and it's in Hebrew, but it's an amazing platform. Israel, as I said, it's a public system. We have something called HMO. It's the HMO here is Clalit, is the largest one. It's also a provider and also an insurer. That means that people get services in the hospital, but also community care, and the data flows kind of throughout for 5 million people, which is the half of the population. Now, this is, they have an EMR, but they have trouble with, having, and it's, I think everyone with physicians, GPs, really getting the essential data, understanding what is the essential data for them, and to be more proactive in what they're doing. So this is the dashboard they actually developed internally with focus groups of GPs and community clinics managers. And this is actually, it's incredible. It's one dashboard that allows you to understand all the different details that are relevant, especially for this type of patient. But it's more, and it has 2 layers. One is more actually to bring the relevant information out of all the information. The second one is a more proactive layer. I think, but the important part is that what it says here, that it's not a black box. Everything there explains to the physician why the decision was made. That will actually gradually help them to be more accepting of the system. Now, there's another complexity of what will be the reimbursement mechanism of being proactive, because the proactivity layer is tricky, because they get a list of patients at risk, either at risk or they need to change treatment. That was also addressed here. But it's spare time of the physicians. So on the one hand, the manager of the clinic, they're really thrilled about it because they get their quality measurements very high because they can prevent. So that's great for them. But now the labor work of Clalit is now kind of protesting for not having enough time for a physician. They have to do additional work. So we'll see how it works. Again, it's step by step. You will say that maybe the AI components are not less impressive, but it is something in use of physicians, which highly implemented within the system. You saw it, it's in Hebrew. So, as I was saying, we have small language models because Hebrew is not target market for most of the applications, but here we can see a collaboration of another HMO with Microsoft trying to analyze and create an open tool for Hebrew. Now, really, in the last few minutes, I think that we cannot discuss of Israel without looking at the health consequences of the war. And you know, in 7th of October, we had 1,300 people, over 1,300 people brutally murdered by Hamas. And I don't wish it for any country, but I do wish the resilience of the Israeli people, Arabs and Jews together, to cope with that. This is me, sorry. But I will show you an adaptation from research and from the academy. So here we see Gen AI for VI, for victim identification. It was actually been addressed in cancer and was pivoted along with a lot of different informatics to identify burnt victims, over a few dozens of victims that were able to be identified by that. Again, it's like a collaboration with a lot of different organizations. What's important here that it's, when we look at climate change, you look at other and extreme situations, there are a lot of ways to implement these kind of things as well. And the last part, it's actually also related, but it's because we have a lot of mental health crisis around that. We have developed, again, it was with Microsoft as a basis for Hebrew, but it took a month and a half to have a Gen AI and mental health assistant in Hebrew to diagnose different conditions, not to treat. They also launched it last week at HIMSS, at Global HIMSS, in the English version of it. Now, when I look at the take-home message, at least from my part, and I would love to have more discussion during these 2 days. So, in doing that, we always need to look at the 3 dimensions. There are a lot of different components, and it's a work in progress. But you definitely need to consider the integration and the workforce part. The second part is, it is quite amazing to have the ability to do a nationwide transformation like that, driven by people, driven by capacity building. It's possible everywhere. And I need to have a reference like everyone did about the computer not going to change, to replace physicians. Everybody's talking about Dune and you know how it predicted the ecology. But I want to reference a different book dated in 1966. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's one of the first evidence of really describing AI. And definitely something that we need to consider all the time, how to get involved with the medical team step by step. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yael. We have time eventually for a very quick question. Okay, we are running a little bit late, so again, thank you again for your time, for your talk. So now it's time for a coffee break. We have 20 minutes. So at 11 sharp, we start the second session, which is the role of data. So see you in 20 minutes back.